عفت العمس عمس يتنانقو حسود أنيسهم حسود كفا يولدو عفت العمس عمس يتنانقو حسود أنيسهم حسود كفا يولدو حمام غابنا قصة اتدمنيا بعلو قساسي بعلو زغاون دانيا معربات زي كنت لا قعزو تاريخنا سنكو دا ايكون مزاري ودمنا وريد وزغدامي تقربي سندي عامي معسكنير وعظمي عجونا دكيري ترى بعراينا بزبلة يبل عرفي يصنع غزمنا
Great Decisions 1989 is made possible by grants from the J. Patrick and Christine R. Barrett Foundation and by the Star Foundation.
Hello, I'm Peter Crow. Welcome to Great Decisions. The topics in this series are drawn from the Great Decisions briefing book of the Foreign Policy Association. This week we look at the Horn of Africa, an impoverished region that few Americans know firsthand. Mention of it conjures images of famine, homeless refugees, and civil wars. It is a truly desolate land, which nevertheless has attracted superpower interest. The Horn of Africa juts out from the northeast corner of the continent. Running through the region is a strategic waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean. Two choke points lie at either end. In the north, the Suez Canal. In the south, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Sorrow. If either were blocked, shipping would have to go clear around the southern tip of Africa. With no troops in the area, the U.S. worries that in a crisis, Soviet footholds in the region would lead to just such a situation.
The Soviets have many hundreds of advisors, military and civilian, and they have a small naval infantry presence off the Ethiopian coast at a place called Dalak Island, where they actually have a small combat presence.
Still, most people know of this region only because of the intense publicity over the 1984 famine and international relief efforts, including the televised Live Aid concert, watched by more than 1.5 billion people, 85% of the world's television audience.
There's a tremendous amount of humanitarian interest, I think, in this country. We are humanitarian leaders around the world in the kinds of crises that the countries of the Horn have faced in recent years. I'm thinking of the famine in Ethiopia, the current problems of civil war and displaced persons in Sudan, as well as tribal fighting and suffering in Somalia.
The Horn of Africa is racked by the longest-running civil wars in the world, rooted in racial, religious, and ethnic conflict. A typical example is Sudan, Africa's largest country, 3 times the size of Texas, and a recipient of U.S. aid.
There is a religious and ethnic struggle between the government in Khartoum and the southern populations who are black African and non-Islamic in their orientation over the control of the country and the orientation of the country, the very identity of Sudan. Is it an African state? Is it an Arab state? Is it some mixture?
Despite Sudan's internal problems, it supports rebellion in Ethiopia's northern provinces, Tigray and Eritrea. In return, Ethiopia's Marxist government supports Sudan's rebels. Soviet-supported Ethiopia, the world's most impoverished nation, also faces boundary problems on its eastern flank in the province of Ogaden. Somalia, which enjoys U.S. support, covets Ogaden, which is populated primarily by ethnic Somalis. In the midst of all this conflict lies tiny Djibouti, still protected by France 12 years after its independence, enabling it to maintain its freedom and strict neutrality.
The French are very, very well entrenched and have a protecting role, in a sense, in Djibouti. They have a combat presence of French troops there, which is substantial.
This unending series of civil wars and border disputes worsens the region's inherent problems of cyclical drought and poor soil. The fighting further ravages land already devastated by overgrazing, soil erosion, and falling water tables. Famine has been intensified by attempts of government and rebel forces to intercept food relief, in effect, using food as a weapon. These endless conflicts keep the region volatile, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union alert to sudden shifts in the local power balance. But if peace were to develop and the region stabilized, would U.S. interests lessen?
We do have interest in terms of our power projection capabilities in the Indian Ocean, which I suspect will continue to support our fleet operations and our air as well through facilities access in selective points along the western Indian Ocean littoral. I don't think that will end anytime soon.
I asked Secretary Crocker if this type of superpower involvement in local conflict is indicative of the kinds of problems and responsibilities the United States will have to face in the future.
It is, in a sense, a typical third world set of situations that we face in the Horn of Africa. It's worse than many because the conflicts are so deeply rooted, and there are so many pressures towards what you might call centrifugal forces that could lead even to the breakup of states. I'd also point out that there is a potential here for the tail to wag the dog. It is local conflicts that can sometimes stir up unnecessary rivalries or unnecessary confrontations between outside powers. Americans too often, I think, engage in scapegoating and devil theory, which points at themselves and says in effect, blame America first, or else blame Moscow first. In this case, it's quite clear to me that the local powers seek to use the superpowers. So we have a unique opportunity as well as a challenge here, not only to define the limits of our interest and our involvement, but also to see what we can do to be constructive. I am confident that without the constructive action of outside powers like ourselves, these conflicts could go on and could get worse. So we have a responsibility, as has been demonstrated, I think, in southwestern Africa, in Angola and Namibia, to help shape an agenda for peace which could not be shaped locally.
Joining me to discuss the many issues the United States faces in the Horn of Africa are Richard Allen, Ronald Reagan's first national security advisor, Karen Elliott House, foreign editor for the Wall Street Journal, and Madeleine Albright, Professor of International Affairs at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Karen, when mention is made of the Horn of Africa, people's eyes tend to glaze over. Should they, or is this a region of some importance to the United States?
I think once you establish where it is, then you recognize it's a region of some importance, that one tends to think of southern Africa or something else when you think of the Horn. It's in the region where we get a lot of oil, and it is on the fringes of the waterway between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And it's actually become more important, I would argue, in the last 10 years because as Saudi Arabia has run oil pipelines across its country to put oil out into ships in the Red Sea rather than the Persian Gulf, then this connection becomes even more important.
Well, is it important because the oil is there or because the Soviets are there?
Both.
Yeah, I would say both, but it seems to me that the policies of the last 10 years or so have been very successful. The combined policies of the Carter administration and the Reagan administration have achieved a major objective, and I think it's less important today because the Soviets are there. That is not to say that the Soviet presence is not important in some respect to us, but basically in the era in which we're now entering, with the Soviets shrinking their commitments overseas, that factor becomes less important. I think we have objective strategic interests in that region, and obviously objective humanitarian.
Why has the Soviets put so much into this region?
Well, I think primarily because they have seen that we were interested in it at a certain period and because of the geography that both Karen and Dick have mentioned. But I think that what we have to see it as is a little bit historically, because I think our interest in the area has really come about as a result of a period when we were afraid of the way the Soviets were behaving in the Third World. And in 77, 78, during that crisis, this was an example of the fact that while the Soviets were negotiating a SALT treaty, they were not really interested in developing good relationships and be a responsible world power. And then as the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Carter administration worked very hard to set that area up because they saw it as being so important to a strategic framework in that area.
Well, who drew who in there? Did we draw the Soviets in, or did they draw us in?
It's difficult to establish.
Simultaneous arrival?
Well, I think it was somewhat simultaneous, but after all, President Carter did declare the region to be vital to U.S. strategic interest. It was the basis of the Carter Doctrine, if you will. It was something that was never repudiated by his successor, President Reagan. There are, I think, some huge strategic requirements there from the standpoint of the United States because 70 or 75% of the free world's oil is affected by the region.
If you remember what was going on in the world at the time Carter declared that a strategic interest, it was in the period when the Shah was falling in Iran and the Soviets were going into Afghanistan. So concern about that region was heightened, and the fear that if something goes wrong on this side, on the Persian Gulf side, then the Red Sea, Horn of Africa side becomes even more important. So I think they did a little wise advanced planning.
That too, and then let's not short sell the decision of the Reagan administration to provide arms over a period of 8 years, beginning with the AWACS decision, for example, although it's only remotely concerned with this particular region. It did nonetheless signify that the United States was willing to stand up for its friends in Somalia, for example, where there were huge stockpiles of Soviet equipment. We even started a program of making spare parts for that Soviet equipment to make it run more efficiently once the Somalis were on our side.
Well, we're still head on head with the Soviet Union in the region. I mean, they're there, we're there. Is this an area for disengagement now? Is this an area in which we should test the Soviet willingness to wind down regional conflicts?
Well, I think it is an area where we ought to discuss with the Soviets the possibility of winding it down. What's interesting, I think, about the area is that we kind of pay attention to it once every 5 or 10 years. Even though we are seeing that it's strategically important to us, Americans have a very short attention span on this particular kind of an issue. And 5 years ago when the famine was so great in Ethiopia, we focused on it. Now it's not as important, and yet it ought to be one of the subjects that is discussed during summits when the Soviets and the Americans talk about regional problems.
I think I disagree with that for some of the reasons Chet Crocker mentioned, that there are so many religious, ethnic, long-running battles there that to make a high-level focus on let's somehow disengage or try to solve these and then disengage probably raises the whole thing to a level that can cause trouble rather than bring solutions.
Is the area better off without either of us there, or
it's not just
better off just left to itself?
No, it's not just a case of the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. The Europeans have very real interest there and an enormous presence. And if anybody should be encouraged to take up the slack, it should be the Europeans. I also believe that the Japanese in this new era of prosperity ought to have their attention refocused, whether they do it themselves or whether it's done conveniently for them by outside pressures, on picking up more of the burden in that region.
What form would that take?
Well, I think in terms of aid programs of a variety. But I don't think that the superpowers can be left out of this. I granted that there are an awful lot of different problems there, and Chet Crocker, I think, stated them very well. But I do think that there are large parts of what's going on there that becomes enmeshed in superpower politics and general politics.
Does that make those matters worse, as you see it?
I think it makes them worse. I think it exacerbates the problem, which is why it's better to try to have some agreed-on disengagement, since the Soviets themselves can't afford to be as supportive.
Let me just disagree with that from a little point of view. You can get us both into disagreement here, but it seems to me that by keeping the pressure on the Soviets and by indicating that there will be a firm American commitment in the region to protect the interests of our friends and to defend against potential aggressors, that this will hasten the day when the Soviets will decide that it's time to pull out. I think that strategy has worked best. It's worked best over the course of the last 8 or 9 years, and I'd like to continue that strategy. If it ain't broke, don't try to fix it.
Well, if they do disengage, if we have a disengagement here, the Soviets fold their tents in the area, can we do the same? Turn our backs on it and go about our business elsewhere?
Well, this is not a major drain on America. And it seems to me that just what Dick said, that it's not a major cost to us, and that having a presence there and perhaps encouraging the Europeans to play a more active role with the presence they have there does tend to keep people from getting ideas about misbehavior that might then cause real problems that we would have to try to deal with in a much more
But by being around there, we seem
way.
to get drawn in to people's civil wars, people's secessionist movements, people's border wars. Do we really have any business getting drawn into these matters?
Well, yeah, I think we do, and I think it's good for the United States, good for the interests of our allies, and probably good for the people of the region. But I don't think we are drawn in quite as deeply as your remark might have suggested, Peter. I think that if we're drawn in by providing forms of specific aid, military aid, and equipment, and other kinds of infrastructure help designed to keep those people at least with their heads above water. I think it's really important.
Well, our policy generally in Africa, well, around the world, is we don't want borders to change. And that policy is highlighted particularly in this region. Is this a correct and viable policy, Karen, do you think?
Probably yes, because if you start talking about changing borders in Africa, it raises all kinds of problems that no one wants to get into. I just would like to make the point again to get some focus on the fact that for oil reasons, again, I think one has to think of the Red Sea and this whole Horn of Africa as more important than it was 10 years ago. Because in the intervening time, as the worry about the access to the Persian Gulf has gone up, the Saudis have built and the Iraqis have built across Saudi Arabia a pipeline. There's a great deal of oil going across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea for transit to some one of us who needs it. And that, for oil reasons, one shouldn't just kind of say, well, we might as well pick up and leave the region and let them fight it out.
I think we do have to think about our national interest, and I think we have to decide whether being there is in our national interest, whether it involves us in rivalries between the various groups within the area. And I would say that, you know, we talk a lot about the Soviet presence. It is changing in the way that the Soviets make themselves present. All you have to do is follow Foreign Minister Shevardnadze's activities in the last 2 weeks, where he has been in the area making suggestions. He has not been specifically in the Horn, but he's been in Egypt. And I think generally the Soviets are being more subtle about the way that they're exerting their influence, and therefore we cannot withdraw.
Well, let us take a look at what not withdrawing might look like country by country. Ethiopia appears to be a failing Soviet enterprise. What should we be doing?
Continue to make it fail. Increase the heat on
Continue
Ethiopia.
to let it fail, not make it fail.
Well, all right, we'll do it your way.
No, I don't think we're the ones who are making it fail. The
that's
Soviets
correct.
and the Ethiopians are.
Permit him to fail and try to increase that pressure wherever possible. The Mengistu regime is an inhumane regime, has been for a long time. The cruelty that's been visited upon the people of Ethiopia should not have happened. And I think, once again, that the United States has an opportunity to squeeze wherever possible and make a dictator of the ilk of this one fall eventually through popular pressure or whatever it may take. But it's our moral obligation, I think, in our political long-range interests, to keep that pressure on.
Madeline,
how-
you're an expert on Ethiopia.
Well, this is
What
where I
should we be
think
doing?
our moral problems show the fact that how hard it is to define that. Morally, does that mean that we let the people of Ethiopia starve? Because what
Absolutely
we're really
not.
doing
Absolutely
is
not.
sending in food aid. We're not really giving other kinds of assistance
Yes.
to them.
Which is being impeded, by the way.
Right, especially by some of the political disputes. I don't know how you help the people and punish Mengistu, who really is a very bad man, who I think adapted a communist system in order to keep himself in some kind of military dictatorial power. And that the Soviets are having a lot of trouble figuring out what to do with his version of Marxism-Leninism. So I don't know, I think we would agree on the end, but the means of how to really squeeze him, I'm not sure we've got the leverage beyond punishing the people.
And what should be our position on the Eritrean and Tigran rebellions and secessionist movements? Should we be involved there?
Well, the Eritreans have managed to carry theirs on a long time without any major help from anybody. I personally don't see a reason to get deeply involved in any of those conflicts, because they spring from things that we have no control over and can't change, and that to me is one where it seems you can get yourself in all kinds of hot water without any assurance about
But would
the
you
outcome.
include, for example, if we could find a way effectively to support these people who are fighting to rid themselves of this dictatorial presence, would you oppose utilizing such a channel and, for example, providing weapons, more modern weapons for these people?
No, it would seem to me there's nothing wrong with providing weapons to the Eritreans
Right.
the way we did to the Afghans, and I think they are people who do have a determination and a will to win that may actually make them prevail, which is probably in our interest. I guess I become more like Madeline here on this. I don't particularly see the reason to rush in and get deeply involved.
I guess it's a matter of judging what you mean by rush in or becoming deeply involved, because if we can stand off at arm's length and provide the wherewithal for these people to continue their struggle, then I think we really have an obligation to do that.
In a quiet way, I think
In a quiet
that's
way,
fine.
without becoming deeply involved, or so that our feet are planted in quicksand someplace.
But without offending Eritreans, I think that we can't really say that they are the freedom fighters of the Horn, that they are the mujahideen, or somebody that is really all right is on their side. It's a very complex question. Haile Selassie had trouble with the issue.
Sure.
There has been this separatist movement in that area, and I think your earlier question, Peter, is as to whether we are for more and more smaller countries and redrawing lines. It's a very hard question, because this becomes, the Eritreans have theoretically also been used by Palestinians or PLO fragments in order to try to disrupt Ethiopia. So it's very hard to make an assessment of it.
Talking about the size of countries, we've got a very big one to the north of Ethiopia in Sudan. And we have there, or they have there, really a raging civil war between the North and the South, a racial conflict, a religious conflict, a conflict in which food is being used as a weapon, where there are real humanitarian concerns extant. What should we be doing there? Should we stand back, let this civil war run its course, or?
Out of that one, I think we should stay. You might say this is selective outrage, but that one is clearly one that meets the criteria that Karen and Madeline were discussing. Getting into that one would be a can of worms for the United States, and I don't see any reasonable way for us to involve ourselves in it.
I think our interest in the Sudan is as it affects Egypt. We do have an interest in Egypt, and the Egyptians worry about what goes on in Sudan because the Sudanese can mess up their water supplies, and obviously if you get a Gaddafi-type man in Sudan, it affects next door Egypt. So I would take cues. I would basically stay out and then take cues on what one's potential role ought to be from the Egyptians.
Well, in the Sudan, we have food being used as a weapon, almost to the point of committing genocide against the tribes in the south, chiefly the Dinkas. And we're trying to move food to them. Should we be doing that? Is that our role? And should we be really bulldozing it through to them? Should we get it through to them?
Yes.
I think we
yes.
should work with private voluntary agencies and other countries to get the food in there, because ultimately one of the questions that we have as we look at a complex area like this is, do we have humanitarian responsibilities to people starving? And I think we do. Now, that it's a very tough issue because it does get us somewhat involved, but I think this can be done as not just a United States effort, that we ought to get other countries into there.
But if America does stand for human rights, as we all say it should, I mean, it seems to me it should be our position around the world that we are against starvation and we are against dictators or guerrillas or anyone else using food as a weapon on people, which of course that means we shouldn't use it as a weapon as we've tried to at times in the past. But I think that is one worth trying hard to do, get food through to people.
Clearly that's a priority for the Bush administration to focus worldwide attention on this problem. And if we're looking for new tasks for a new administration, I think beefing up the USIA efforts in this regard and mobilizing others, and the President and others speaking more frequently about this kind of a problem in order to isolate it, because you can only foster collective public outrage by someone taking the lead. And in our country, typically that someone is the President of the United States or some very high-ranking official. So I would agree completely that we have that responsibility, and something very practical and pragmatic can be done about it. Speak about it.
Do you think this new administration should pay more attention to Africa, and do you think it will?
I think it's essential that they pay more attention. I think all of us applaud what the Reagan administration did in Southern Africa. It took a long time. Many people were critical of how long it took. And I think there are various aspects of it in terms of our relationship to South Africa that were a problem. But basically what the Reagan administration did was ignore black Africa and ignore the problems of the rest of Africa. And I think that we as, again, interested in our national interest, ought to take a greater interest in what's happening in West Africa and East Africa and in the center, and think about the various problems that will be confronting us on a worldwide scale.
I think that's one where the Europeans should be playing a bigger role. A country does have to have priorities, and I would argue that our priority should be Latin America more than Africa. And I don't think I think you can do two things at one time, but the Europeans are closer to Africa. They were the colonizers of Africa.
Can I bring up a
afford
domestic
it.
problem? Because I think one of the things that those of us that are interested in foreign policy often forget the link between domestic and foreign policy. A major proportion of American people come from Africa. They are calling themselves now African Americans. We have a reason to be interested in Africa for domestic purposes.
Dick, what do you think?
Well, I think the administration should encourage, the new administration should encourage others. I believe the last administration that had a fault of ignoring black Africa ignored it because of the burning issue of the Southern African problems. And those problems now seem to be largely behind us or on the way to settlement. But I do agree that the Europeans have that major responsibility. They were the ones, as Karen points out, who drew the lines. We talked about border changes. They drew those boundaries, and those boundaries are still, even today, causing major tribal and ethnic problems in Africa. I believe they ought to be involved with specific and concrete aid for this problem. This is not just a U.S. problem, and although I'm sympathetic with the aspect that Madeline mentions, these people have a right to demand that the United States pay attention. It doesn't mean that we have to shoulder the entire responsibility ourselves.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Madeline. Karen. Until next week, for Great Decisions, I'm Peter Crow.
عفات العمس عمس يتنانقو حسوت أنيسهم حسوت كفاء يولدو عفات العمس عمس يتنانقو حسوت أنيسهم حسوت كفاء يولدو حمامو غابدا قصة اتدمنيا بعلو خساسي بعلو صغار ودانيا معربات زي كنتلا قعزو تاريخنا سنكودو ايكون زاري ودمنا وريد وزغدامي تقربي سندي عامي معسكنير وعقمي عجونا دكيري ترى بعراينا مزبلة يبل عرفي يصنع غلطمنا